Hi, I'm Darren Meyer. I'm the lead solution architect for Endor Labs, and we're going to talk about dependency management as a legal and standards and regulatory compliance concern. So when you import open source dependencies into your applications, they have all the benefits that we've talked about before, but they also raise not only just security and operational risks, but also legal compliance risks. You have standards that you have to comply with, you have laws and regulations that you have to comply with, and you have to make auditors happy at the end of the day. So let's start with legal compliance. There are a few legal requirements you should be aware of that affect your choice of open source dependency and your ability to manage them across your organization. The federal government requires an SBOM, a software bill of materials, that enumerates everything that you have in a piece of software that you use to provide government services or sell to the government directly. There's also an emerging requirement for you to be able to disclose any vulnerabilities that might impact that software bill of materials and correct critical ones within a defined period of time. Exact thing depends exactly on what standard and who you're doing business with. FedRAMP, for example, has a 90-day compliance requirements in most cases. Adopting a dependency means that you're accepting all the vulnerabilities that it may have as risks, and you have to manage those risks and be able to answer an auditor's question about how you're going to address them. And it also means accepting its license terms. All of these components of your software are subject to copyright, and their license permits you to use them under certain constraints. And those constraints can be anything from very, very lightweight to requiring you to disclose your own source code if you use them, as an example of the GNU GPL. So you have to be able to understand what licenses you're imposing and be able to create and enforce policy around those obligations so that you understand what you have to do in order to stay on the good terms and not get sued over copyright infringement. In order to do that, you have to have an accurate dependency graph. That is, you have to know not only what dependencies that you rely on directly, but what additional dependencies those things might bring into your environment. And you have to have good visibility into every piece of that dependency graph on both license requirements and vulnerabilities. This leads into a standards compliance conversation. So you may be required as a part of complying with the standards or through contracts with certain customers or certain vendors in some cases to comply with industry standards. For example, the PCI DSS requires a degree of vulnerability management in your organization. And again, to do vulnerability management, you have to understand what you have in your environment and what vulnerabilities impact it. You may also be required to meet requirements set up by certain benchmarks, such as the CIS benchmark that's championed by GitHub. These often require some kind of a routine review or supervision of your environment and change management so that you know what you're bringing into your environment as your application evolves. Many of these standards also require some degree of policy compliance, where you have to write a clear policy and enforce it across your org. And that's least costly to address if you can actively enforce a policy up front. While the auditors will usually accept that you have a policy that you then go investigate and correct, it is very expensive to go and correct policy violations after they happen. It's much more cost effective to be able to address policy prior to shipping software, as early in the software development lifecycle as is practical, because it just simply costs less than having something go out to production and having to come back and fix it and keep track of all the evidence that you investigated and responded appropriately. And auditors really ultimately what they want is not that you're secure, but they want evidence that you're complying, right? So your goal is to be able to say to an auditor, look, we have an evidence-based technical control that prevents these things that our policy prohibits and detects these other things that our policy prohibits, that supports our policy and remediation program. And then here is the evidence that I have that shows you that this is what we're doing. So this looks like being able to show an auditor, here's the system that we have in place and how it works. And here's a software bill of materials in a standardized format, such as SPDX or CycloneDX. And also to be able to say, we understand what risks this is bringing into our environment. We understand how those things interface with our policy. And here is our program that shows that when we identify these risks and these compliance issues, we go after them and remediate them in a reasonable amount of time.